The narrator pried the warped wax seal away with a fingernail and revealed a page scored with a circle, a cross of brass dust, and a small brass cog pressed into the paper's fibers. Suspicion tightened his fingers as he set the candle nearer to read the ink. That suspicion had driven him into the archives that evening and now demanded action rather than careful distance. He did not say the word aloud. He moved with the motion of someone rehearsed in restraint. Fingers bare of glove to feel texture, spectacles slid lower to steady vision, a measured inhale before he spoke. The presence of cold metal in a manuscript contradicted everything the keeper of the archives and the apprentice binder had been taught to expect. The stakes were clear. Either this folio was a singular prank bound by a past hand, or it was evidence that John Dee, or someone in his circle, had built language into a working mechanism. The narrator set the folio flat and said, "Keeper, look at this." The keeper crossed the room, lamp in hand, and the sound of wood on parquet cut the silence. The keeper touched the cog only with the tip of a gloved finger and frowned. "It is fused," he said, "not merely fixed. It sits in the paper like a nail in oak." Within 5 sentences the problem had been stated plainly. Metal in paper, deliberate alignment marks, and a presence of design where previous readers had read angelic text. The narrator's suspicion had turned to focused curiosity. His hands did not tremble, but his voice shortened into crisp orders. "Apprentice, fetch the binder's tools and the loop," he said. The apprentice binder arrived quickly, carrying a small chest of instruments and a worried look that showed he had been forewarned by the keeper's earlier tone. They set lamps in a triangle. The narrator instructed the apprentice to hold the folio at a slight angle while he inspected marginalia. Inked measurements traced arcs and tiny hash marks in a ruler like sequence. The keeper ran a thumb over a corner and found an erased number beneath the margin note. The archive room smelled of beeswax and old leather. The physical details mattered. The ink sat atop a faint embossing, and the brass dust around the cog formed a ring that matched no ornamentation. The narrator's curiosity hardened into a working hypothesis. If these marks respond to motion, this diagram may be a schematic rather than a prayer. The keeper's jaw tightened. "We do not turn pages to test them," he said. "We preserve." "Preserve what if it kills us if opened wrongly?" The narrator replied. His question was precise and intended to force a choice. The keeper recited the archive rules: no experiments, no unsupervised manipulations, a duty to future readers. The apprentice held the loop and watched both men. The room's tension rose. The narrator recognized the shape of it. Duty in conflict with the need to know. They began a cautious inspection. The apprentice traced a margin glyph with a clean brush, while the narrator noted microscopic abrasions, following an index of notches. The markings lined up with the teeth on the cog. The narrator, the apprentice, to reproduce a simple stroke sequence from a stained marginal note. The apprentice hand hesitated, then followed the order: down, across, curl, stop. The sequence matched a faint wear pattern where a gear's rim might sit. When the apprentice finished, a breath of air colder than the lamps moved along the page and raised the hair at the back of the keeper's neck. The narrator felt a shift from curiosity into a thin thread of apprehension. He had expected dust and brittle ink. He had not expected a discrete, testable motion in the object. "Try another angle," the narrator. The apprentice complied, and the ink along one line broke in a hairline fissure, a thin sound like dry skin tearing. The narrator listened. That sound altered the scale of his choices. The suspicion hardened into a demand for an experiment. He did not say he wanted to complete Dee's work. He said he wanted to know whether written positions were inert or engineered to act. The keeper objected. "We cannot risk changing the document." The narrator answered calmly, "We can risk this room knowing why the page was made this way. We owe that much to history." A dispute followed on the archival corridor steps, voices low, urgent, and clipped. The keeper used archival terms to argue for containment. The narrator used procedural terms to argue for controlled testing. The apprentice intervened twice, each time with short lines. There is a sequence here. The hash marks are repeated. The keeper's voice sharpened. If this is a mechanism, we do not activate it. The narrator's reply was not a plea. We will activate it under watch, with instruments, and with the room sealed. They returned to the table. The narrator assembled a loose brass wheel from the apprentice's chest, an instrument the binder kept for book repairs. He fit it to the plate following D's alignment marks and tightened a thumb screw until the wheel engaged the paper at 3 points. The action changed the room's rhythm. The narrator turned the wheel very slowly with his thumb and forefinger. At the first rotation, the page emitted a fine dust, and the candle flame shivered as if a narrow draught had passed through. The narrator's prior curiosity shifted into alarm. His throat worked. He swallowed and measured his breath. The keeper stepped back and gripped the edge of the table. The apprentice's hands went white around the loop. The wheel turned again and microscopic cracks opened and closed along the ink lines like the skin of a bell. A breeze colder than the air in the corridor slipped across the page and carried a metallic tang. "Stop!" the keeper, voice high. He lunged for the wheel, but the narrator kept his hand on the rim and said, "One more turn." His decision came from the narrator's compulsion to test a hypothesis. Curiosity had become an urgent, controlled compulsion. He completed the turn. The inkweb brightened along a particular sequence, and a thin blue bloom moved like oil over iron above the surface of the folio. The narrator felt the earliest form of fear. His hands tightened, his jaw set, and he noticed the precise quality of his skin's sweat. The apprentice whispered, "I can read letters now that were not visible." He bent forward with the loop. The marginalia rearranged themselves under the loop into a layered cipher. The apprentice read in short, clipped phrases, name, audience, port. He stopped and said, "This redirects the address. It's not for angels alone." Hearing that, the narrator's fear deepened into alarm. The keeper, who had argued for preservation, found his features hardening into a protective rage. Who would reroute a device to that audience? The keeper demanded. His voice filled the room and the apprentice flinched. The narrator replied, "Either D discovered a different receiver or someone later altered the plate. We must test for both possibilities." They debated a controlled completion. The keeper insisted on sealing the door and marking the entry. The narrator agreed to a written protocol and asked the apprentice to record every movement. The apprentice's pen scratched paper. The decision to proceed shifted them from examiners to participants. The narrator's suspicion had become a moral and professional challenge that required concrete steps, rather than mere conjecture. They completed the configuration. The narrator placed the wheel in the final notch and instructed the apprentice to align a small brass pin to the cipher's center. The keeper stood a pace behind him. The narrator's mouth was dry. "On my count." The apprentice nodded, his jaw working. 1, 2, 3. The narrator pushed the wheel fully into place. A glyph formed above the plate as if traced by a ghostly stylus. The glyph rose from the ink in thin strokes of pale light, and then unfolded into the shape of a blueprint. It did not float like mist. It held crisp edges and the precise angles of engraved design. The room's air vibrated. The apprentice stepped back and dropped the loop. "I see diagrams," he said. "Not words only. Instructions." Then there was pressure against the thresholds of the room. It was not a sound, but a sensation of a boundary pressing inward from the walls. The keeper seized the narrator's sleeve and said, "Close it now." The narrator felt a surge of responsibility and the pull of discovery at the same time. He reached for the wheel to reverse the motion. A voice entered the room, not with words, but with a sequence of vibrations that the narrator felt on his teeth. For an instant he recognized the cadence of D's recorded prayers as rendered in the folio, and the vibrations matched no human breath. The narrator's emotion moved again. From alarm into stark, physical fear. He gripped the wheel with both hands, and the brass pin warmed under his palm. The glyph tightened into an aperture of light, and an outline of a presence pressed against the aperture like a hand against the inside of a clock. The apprentice swore under his breath and took a step back. The keeper raised his voice in a single command, "Hold." He pulled a length of black linen over the folio in a practiced motion. The light stuttered. The pressure eased. When the linen was removed, a brass cog lay fused to the page exactly where the aperture had rested. New ink had appeared in the margins in a hand none of them remembered writing. The narrator bent and read aloud the new note in short phrases. "Bound. Keep watch. Return with lens." His mouth made the sounds slowly, as if tasting them. The keeper wrapped the folio in linen and slid it into a small oak chest with careful motions. The room's dynamics shifted again. Triumph, dread, and a measure of exhaustion. The narrator felt his voice go thin when he said, "We close it and record the test." The keeper snapped ledger pages and listed the folio's new state. The apprentice avoided the chest and kept his hands in his pockets. The narrator locked the chest with 2 tacks and a final wax seal. He closed the lid with a flat palm and felt the reverberation travel up his arm. They argued over containment and study through the night. The keeper wanted the chest taken to the restricted stacks. The narrator wanted catalogue entries, photographic plates, and careful reproduction of the alignment marks. The apprentice suggested a staggered program. Containment first, then a peer-reviewed protocol. Their choices showed different priorities. The keeper's duty to protect, the narrator's duty to know, the apprentice's desire to bridge both. They left the folio sealed in an oak chest under the keeper's key. Dawn seeped through a high, narrow window and cut a pale sliver across the floor. The narrator stood with his hand on the chest for a long moment. In the hours that followed, the narrator catalogued his notes, rechecked each photographic negative, and cut a thin template copy of the cipher with a needle for later analysis. He recorded everything in short lines and dated each action. His entries show a clear sequence: suspicion, controlled experiment, activation, fusion, containment. Those steps rewrote the immediate history of DS Folio. 2 surprises emerged before the chapter's close. First, the marginal cipher's redirection suggested D had deliberately embedded a failsafe that could redress the operator field. That revelation changed how the narrator interpreted earlier marginalia across multiple folios. Second, the newly fused cog bore a shallow signature gouge across its rim, a maker's mark that matched a tool in D's own satchel inventory. The narrator read the mark out loud and felt a chill in the bones of his hands. "This matches DS plate set," he told the keeper. The keeper looked at him and said, "Then it was meant to move?" They recorded the new evidence in the ledger, and the keeper placed the chest on a high shelf in a locked alcove. The apprentice refused to touch the chest again and kept his distance when the keeper carried it away. The narrator watched the oak's iron clasp click in the keeper's hands and felt the final emotion for the chapter settle into a steady resolve. He did not make any broad pronouncements. He made notes. He removed his spectacles and rubbed his eyes. The chapter ends with a concrete, situational beat. The narrator seals his own field notes inside a small packet and tucks them into the chest beside the folio. He slides the packet under the brass cog before the keeper shuts the lid. The keeper notices, pauses, and asks, "Why put them in now?" The narrator answers, "So the first record sits with the device. If it moves again, someone will know we were here." He closes the chest with a final push. The sound of the lid meets the rim, and the chapter finishes on that physical, decisive click. The embedded brass cog beneath the grimoire clicked, turned once, and a voice snapped, "Give it to me now." Suspicion tightened the narrator's jaw as Elena jerked back from the reading lamp and the conservation bench. He moved before he thought, elbowing papers aside, keeping his hand on the leather cover the way one keeps a passport in a crowded station. The problem was immediate and concrete. A mechanism inside a page had moved, an outsider demanded custody. And the archive's chain of custody could determine whether a device stayed under study or vanished into private hands. The narrator had seen unusual repairs before, but not a cog embedded between paper fibers. He kept his round tortoiseshell spectacles low on his nose, the brass compass in his pocket warm against his palm, and he scanned the visitor's doorway for faces. He recognized the shadowed cut of the man who pushed through the transit curtain. A patron who never showed his face at daytime, here now as shuttered lamps hummed. Eleanor stood with one hand clamped to her chest, loose gloves wrinkled at the wrist. She kept pointing at the gear with a hand that trembled. "Eleanor, the narrator, tell me what you felt." There was no time for theories. The cog had moved. That single motion raised an immediate conflict about custody, study, and safety. The narrator had pried a wax seal in the previous vault search and found the page with a cross of brass dust and a small cog pressed into the fibers. He kept that memory precise, how the wax cleaved and the cog scraped faintly against his thumbnail. Now the same cog had reacted under a lamp. The stakes were clear. A physical object behaved like a machine, and people with claims wanted it. He felt a second motion in himself. Curiosity pulsed under suspicion, pushing him to examine rather than hand the page over. He straightened his coat and stepped toward the bench. "Who are you to demand archives?" "Sir William Harrow," without moving into the light. His voice came clipped, formal, the cadence of a man used to notarized papers and courtroom air. "You have no authority." He held a thick folio with a red ribbon, but did not open it. "Sir William," the narrator, placing a hand on the table to steady himself, "you have a claim. We have rules. Present your documents in the antechamber." The narrator watched the shadowed patron, whom the staff called only the shadow patron, stand on the threshold like a cutout. The man's coat was a dark wash. He did not step forward. "Eleanor, did the cog move again?" The narrator, Eleanor nodded. "It spun. I heard a click. The paper warmed under my fingers." She lifted her hand and showed the small abrasion along the pad of her thumb where metal had pressed the skin. "It felt. My head snapped like a bell. I nearly dropped it." Her voice shortened at the end. The narrator heard the tremor and felt the second emotion shift. Curiosity bent toward unease. Mateo, the restorer, stepped out from behind a shelf with his magnifier hanging around his neck. He kept his hands clean and quick. His fingers smelled faintly of solvent. "We should isolate it in the lab, Mateo. Not here, not with strangers." He set down a cotton pad carrier and glanced at the narrator. "I'll fetch the frame. We'll test it under controlled conditions." "Do that." The narrator. He kept his voice low. He needed Mateo and Elena both present. Their movements would show whether the plate behaved consistently. He remembered John Dee's marginal note from the page they had opened earlier. A line of angelic letters arranged in a circle, and a small diagram that suggested movement. The narrator had used the notation to reconstruct one small set of instructions in Chapter 1. That earlier fiddling had left a brass cog pressed into paper fibers. Now the plate moved when touched by light and heat. The problem was no longer academic. Eleanor wrapped her gloved fingers around a lamp and steadied the light above the page. The lamp's flame cast hard edges on the circle of ink. The narrator pulled his lens from his coat pocket and held it over the marginal cipher. He bent close enough to taste the honeyed resin that still clung to the stitching of the binding. "The engraved teeth are microscopic," he said. "Look at this." Under the magnification, the etched letters rearranged themselves into a pattern that read like mechanical notation. Short strokes paired with tiny teeth, sequence markers carved in the margin. Eleanor's breath left her in a sharp exhale. "Those aren't decoration," she said. "They read like steps." The narrator touched the cog with the tip of his finger, testing a theory formed from improbability and method. He felt metal cool against his skin, and then the faintest hum that seemed to move through the bench. Mateo's jaw tightened. Mateo kept working with his hands as if the bench itself could be mended. This moment marked an emotion shift. The narrator's initial suspicion now widened into focused determination to prove whether the diagram issued instructions. They moved the plate to the preservation room. The narrator signed custody forms in careful, abbreviated ink. Sir William insisted on waiting in the antechamber with his legal folio. The shadow patron stayed in the corridor, pacing on the flagstones with the same precise metallic steps of a man who checked his pocket watch against a clock he trusted. The narrator had promised the archive's director a report. He had promised himself the truth of the mechanism. He thought of John Dee's words in a reconstructed note. Arrange the letters like teeth, make the alphabet rotate, compel a voice to follow. Mateo set up a provisional frame on the lab bench, a thin brass ring that fit around the cog without bending the paper. He placed a small adjustable lamp at a fixed angle, a phonograph horn nearby to catch sound, and a recording sheet to note the sequence. Mateo's hands moved with practiced economy. I need you steady, Eleanor. Mateo, do not touch the plate without my cue. His voice carried the quiet authority of a restorer who had seen fragile bindings die to rough hands. They initiated a controlled sequence. The narrator read the marginal instructions aloud, pronouncing the angelic letters the way he had practiced from Dee's notes, precise, syllable by syllable. He had tried to avoid cadence that sounded like prayer. He kept it mechanical, algorithmic. The etched teeth began to register under the frame. The cog clicked once as if a spring had drawn tight. A low hum rose behind the bench, vibrating subtly through the floor. Eleanor blinked hard and put her hand to her temple. Her fingers tightened. I hear something, she said. A whisper in the lower register, like a bell under water. Her mouth moved around the sound she attempted to imitate. She could not shape it into human syllables. Mateo adjusted a mic. The hum pitched higher for a moment and then settled. The narrator felt an old, careful dread, fear this time, press against the back of his throat. Stop, Sir William called from the doorway. Moving into light with a legal folder thrust forward. You fools are tampering with property subject to claim. I will have this room sealed. He shoved the folio toward the archivist on duty. Sir William, the narrator, keeping his hands flat on the bench. You may request custody. But you cannot remove an item during active study. We are documenting. We will issue a report. The narrator's voice rose. He felt a cold clarity settle that allowed directness rather than panic. The shadow patron stepped forward, voice even but urgent. You will hand it to me, or there will be consequences. The patron. The room's temperature seemed to alter in a practical way. The oil in the lamp dimmed. The hum intensified for a single second. Mateo used that second to clamp a clear celluloid barrier around the frame. I will not let you take it. Mateo. His hands moved to the lock. A short confrontation followed, tight and verbal. Mateo, open that barrier, Sir William demanded. You cannot obstruct legal process. Sir William, open the ledger. The archivist returned. You cannot have the object without paperwork. You will hand it over. The shadow patron repeated. Now, we will not, Mateo, we will document, and then adjudicate. 3 lines of argument snapped across the room. Then the shadow patron lunged for the bench. Mateo shoved the barrier in front of him. Hands collided. The narrator moved to separate them, fingers grazing the edge of the brass ring. The cog spun violently for a fraction of a second, and a thin ribbon of pale light rose from the plate like a blueprint unfurling. Eleanor froze as the light arced across the room and brushed the left side of her face. Her pupils pulled wide. She went stiff and then slumped against the bench as if the light had harvested her weight. A new, sharper fear took hold of the narrator, the fear of a human mind altered by an object. He had read warnings in marginalia and in rumors, but reading had not prepared him for a colleague's body emptying into sudden stillness. Sir William and the shadow patron both grabbed at the ring as if possession could reclaim what the light had touched. Their fingers closed on brass and paper at the same time. The ring trembled. The plate's hum deepened into a choir of harmonic tones that pressed against the skull like an incoming ship. For one breath, the narrator heard two voices layered. A low mechanical counting and an almost syllable of angelic consonants. Let go. The narrator shouted. He pulled at Sir William's sleeve. Mateo shoved the shadow patron back. The room became a war of hands and legal demands. The plate responded. A latticed sigil rose from the surface, a luminous glyph that rotated slowly and projected across the vaulted ceiling in thin veins of gold and silver. The sigil's pattern brushed Eleanor's temple, and she inhaled sharply, and then began to speak in a voice that was not hers. "Eleanor, what are you saying?" Mateo demanded, stepping toward her. Eleanor's mouth formed words that did not match the phoneme she knew. The narrator felt his throat clench. He recognized the order of the syllables as the sequence they had just read. He could not tell whether the voice came from the plate, from Eleanor, or from somewhere behind the walls. The shadow patron's grip tightened on the ring. His movements were abrupt and precise, as if he had rehearsed them. The room's air felt heavier in a physical way. Dust motes traced slow orbits in the projected light. The narrator slapped the back of his hand against Eleanor's shoulder. "Eleanor, stop," he said. "Eleanor, look at me." He spoke her name like a tether. For a moment she blinked, her eyes refocused to the narrator's steel, grey stare. She mouthed the last syllable and then fell forward against Mateo, knees weak. Mateo caught her and lowered her to a chair. The shadow patron reached into his coat and withdrew a stamped letter. He thrust it toward the archivist. "This is a notarized claim," he said. "Hand it over." "Now," Sir William answered with a similar document and a thin, demanding smile. The narrator read the papers under the lamp's edge. The legal language was precise, but the documents did not account for an activated machine in situ. The archivist moved between claimants and the bench. "We will secure the object and the witnesses. We will not release it without review." He turned to the narrator. "You will file the incident report." The narrator nodded. His hands felt sticky with old resin. He had felt curiosity deepen into dread and then into procedural rigor. He took out his leather-bound notebook and recorded the sequence of events with concise strokes. Cog spun, lamp applied, hum, voice, seizure. Claimants converged, intervened. He wrote with fingers that shook slightly and kept his sentences short. Preserve. Isolate. Test. They moved the plate into a small containment room with a thick oak door and iron bands. Mateo wrapped the frame in archival linen and placed absorbing pads beneath. The narrator set a thin steel clasp over the ring and bolted the latch. They carried Elena to the contiguous infirmary. She sat with a wool blanket and kept rubbing her hands together as if to remember heat. Her speech returned in halting bursts. "I saw lines," she said. "I saw letters move like teeth. They told me a number. I tried to say it, and my throat filled with metal." "What number?" The narrator, he needed specificity. He needed to know whether the sequence matched any marginal cipher they had catalogued. Eleanor pressed her thumb to the scar on her jaw, the same place where she had cut herself months ago, when shelving a heavy folio. She listed digits slowly. 3, 7, 2, 5. She stopped and stared as if the count had exhausted her. "I don't know what it means," she added. Her hands trembled as she folded the blanket across her knees. The narrator referenced the digits in his mind with DS tables. He had worked hours on Enochian transpositions and machine analogues. The number sequence matched neither a page number nor a simple cipher. It matched instead the pattern of teeth on a second, unseen plate described in a note from Dee's hand. The narrator's face tightened. A new practical fear arose. This plate might be only one component of a larger system. He felt an emotion shift toward resolve. They must search for missing parts before others did. Sir William paced outside the infirmary window and tapped the folio in his hands. The shadow patron lingered near the containment door with his coat collar raised. Mateo knelt by the oak chest where they stored secondary fragments and began to run gloved fingers along the grain. The narrator him to be precise, look for cavities, false bottoms, any sign of a missing cog. Mateo ran his fingers along the inside rim of the chest and found a seam under the lining. He pressed and a faint click resounded. "There's a hollow," he said. He pried at the lining and drew out a folded sheet of thick paper that bore an Enochian table. The narrator recognized the ink immediately, the same brown, black mixture D used, and the fold marks matched the way the plate had been stored. The sheet had a space, a blank circular slot where a cog should fit. He unfolded the fragment with precise movements. The blank slot was precisely cut and bordered with engraved letters. The narrator felt his heart rate climb in a clinical, measurable way. This was not a rumor now. It was evidence of a larger mechanical library. The shadow patron's head lifted at the sound and he moved toward them. Sir William stopped short at the threshold when Mateo held the paper out. "Where did you find that?" Sir William demanded. "In the chest, Mateo, under the lining. You were supposed to lock those chests," the archivist said. "We did lock them," the narrator replied. "Someone else had access recently." Silence gathered around that claim like a tightened band. The narrator set the fragment on the bench and traced the blank slot with one forefinger, careful not to press the surrounding ink. The slot matched the cog's diameter to the millimeter. He thought of D's reconstruction of letters arranged like gear teeth, and he realized the implication. The plate they had activated fit into a larger table, an assembly of plates and cogs that together formed a functioning device. The shadow patron swallowed and then spoke in a tone that no longer demanded but negotiated. "We can purchase access," he said. "We can provide security. You will catalog and then sell." His voice was even and mercantile. Sir William's expression shifted from legal certainty to calculation. "You will not negotiate here," the archivist said. "This is state property until adjudicated." Mateo folded the fragment and wrapped it in linen. "If this is one plate of a library," he said, "we cannot leave it unprotected. We need to search the stacks." The narrator watched Sir William and the shadow patron exchange a look. The change of tone between them felt like a pivot. What had been purely legal claim now contained economic appetite. He felt another emotion shift, from resolve to guarded suspicion about the claimant's motives. The archivist to lock the outer doors and to notify the director. Then he gathered the team for a discreet sweep of the lower stacks, before sunlight reached the windows. They moved in small groups. The narrator took Mateo and a junior conservator to the west stacks. Elena remained under observation with a nurse. The shadow patron and Sir William awaited the director in the antechamber. In the stacks, rows of bound folios leaned like teeth. Mateo used a small hooked tool to lift panel lids and check undersides of boxes. He found nothing but dust until he inserted his thumbs into a narrow seam at the back of a sealed oak box and felt the give of a cavity. He pried the lid and found a folded fragment identical in paper and ink, but this one bore a small inscription in the margin. A sequence of angelic letters and a microcog ring soldered to the paper's edge. Mateo held the fragment up. Here his voice was small and precise. He had the habit of speaking with the clipped cadence of a technician. "This one has a ring. It matches the slot." The narrator reached for it and felt the cool brass burn slightly against his finger, as if the metal carried a residue of hum. He kept his face controlled. The discovery altered their understanding. The plates were distributed across the archive, hidden not to preserve them, but to conceal an assembled function. That revelation counted as a mid-chapter cliffhanger. Someone had hidden complementary parts, and the plate they had activated was part of a scattered library. They returned to the containment room with 2 new fragments in hand. Sir William grew more insistent when he learned of the find, softer in voice but firmer in posture. He produced additional notarized claims and, confusingly, a thin letter from a collector that praised D's work and offered funding for a public exhibition. The shadow patron refused to speak about funding. Mateo laid the fragments on the bench and began to assemble a provisional frame that allowed 2 plates to register against one another. The narrator read the ledger of find spots. The pattern of concealment pointed to deliberate distribution across the archive's private holdings. He traced the coordinates with his finger: east chest, west stack, sealed trunk. He felt a practical urgency to catalogue and to secure a map of missing components. The plates were not ornaments. They were parts of an engineered system. They arranged 2 plates in the frame and aligned teeth with letters. The room's hum returned, but softer. Mateo tightened a screw on the count of 3. He said 1. The narrator, 2. Mateo, 3. They said together. The plates engaged with a dry, satisfied sound. The hum built and then folded into a single long tone. The projection from the plate rose again, but this time it did not sweep the ceiling. It descended into a flat, diagrammatic plane above the bench, tracing lines and angles with gold filaments that looked like a mechanical map. The narrator felt the air press across his face. Eleanor, recovered and standing near the doorway with a nurse, put her gloved hand to her mouth and watched. Suddenly, the oak chest in the corner shifted with a soft pop, and a hidden drawer opened by itself, revealing a folded page with a blank slot the size of a cog. The narrator lunged and snatched the page before anyone else could reach it. He held the fragment above the bench light and matched the blank slot to the ring on the second fragment. The fit was exact. The narrator slid his finger into the blank slot and extracted a thin, folded sheet hidden beneath. It was a table fragment bearing an angular diagram and an annotation in DS cramped hand. A note about combinatory order and a short list of locations where further plates had been hidden. The narrator read the locations aloud. The sealed duct. The librarian's private chest. Under the southmost stair tread, each place was concrete and actionable. The discovery changed everything. Someone had catalogued a distributed machine and left a breadcrumb list in Dee's own hand. Outside, footsteps approached the archive door. The director's key turned in the lock as daylight at last found the western panes. The narrator folded the sheet and slipped it into his notebook. He felt the chapter's conflict resolve into a course of action. They could either register the find and bring it into official custody, or they could conceal it and pursue the rest of the library quietly. Mateo looked at him, then at Elena, then at the sealed containment room where the first plate lay silent once more. We have to map it, Mateo. We have to find the rest before others do. Eleanor's hands were steady now, but her voice held small fractures. And we must document the witnesses, she said. We must log every claim, every hand that touched the plates. Sir William stepped forward and produced yet another written demand. But his expression had lost the easy certainty he had in the antechamber. The shadow patron lingered in the doorway like a shadow that could be summoned. The narrator gathered the fragments into a lined box, sealing them with testamentary tape and a notation of the time and the witness names. He recorded the names aloud as he worked. Eleanor, Mateo, Sir William Harrow, the shadow patron. Each name anchored a human presence to the evidence. He closed the chest, slid the folded table fragment into his pocket, and in a measured voice told the archivist to set an overnight guard. The narrator's decision was concrete. They would catalogue, secure, and search the locations Dee had noted. He had moved from suspicion to curiosity, from fear to focus, and now to a guarded resolve that would govern the next steps. As the morning light widened, the narrator stood at the archive's threshold and watched Sir William and the shadow patron leave with their papers. He kept the folded fragment tight in his grasp, feeling the outline of the blank slot through the linen. He signaled the archivist to bolt the door. The brass cog on the Enochian plate clicked and rotated without anyone touching it. Eleanor jerked her hand away from the overlay. A thin smudge of oil streaked her fingertip. Suspicion tightened the narrator's jaw as he lunged forward and planted both palms on the leather cover to steady the grimoire. The noise, a short metallic rasp under the lamp, left a clear problem. The diagrams behaved like mechanisms rather than flat ink. He had felt suspicion since the first seal was pried, but now it governed every precise movement he made. He did not say the word aloud at first. He checked the bench bolts, the scale of the brass teeth, the slight hollow under the plate. Eleanor wiped her fingertip on a linen square and set the rag into a glass jar. "It moved again," she said, and the words landed like a demand. The room was the archive's conservation bench. Late evening. A single daylight lamp threw a narrow cone of white across the plate, and a ring of powdered brass. The narrator introduced no formal identity. He worked with instruments. A small brass pocket compass, a leather notebook, his round spectacles lowered. He touched the page where a small brass cog had been pressed into the paper's fibers, an indentation matched to the cog's teeth. He remembered prying a warped wax seal away in another room. The memory was concrete. The seal cracked beneath his thumbnail and a brass smear adhered to print. That earlier finding shaped his choice now. "Do not let the plate leave the bench. Call Thomas," he said, and dressed to Hale. Now he Thomas' name the way one calls a witness. Eleanor rose and crossed the room. Her boots whispered on stone. Outside the reading room, footsteps accelerated. The narrator turned the grimoire so the plate faced the lamp. He positioned a glass probe against the cog to test for heat. The probe read 3 degrees above room temperature, nothing dramatic, but not inert either. Thomas arrived first, keys clinking against his palm. He wore a curator's gravity, hands that handled documents by their edges, a waistcoat buttoned high. "What happened?" he asked, and his voice indicated inventory, priority, not alarm. The narrator handed him a magnifying lens and pointed at the brass dust cross stamped near the outer ring. "It rotated by itself, Elena. It clicked twice before I stopped it." She kept her sentences short and precise. Hale came next, coat still damp from the rain outside. He moved faster than Thomas and bent over the plate with a scholar's hunger, fingers careful but immediate. "If the inscription instructs motion," he muttered. "We may be looking at an assembly protocol." He assembly with an academic emphasis, as if to ward off panic. The narrator watched him. He recorded names and gestures in his notebook. Eleanor, conservator. Thomas, curator. Hale, visiting scholar. Each name anchored a stance. They worked in a ring. The narrator steadied the grimoire. Eleanor fitted a translucent brass overlay over the printed diagram. The overlay's teeth aligned with the pressed cog. "Treasure." Hale read aloud marginally under a loop, stopping on a cluster of tiny characters littered like measurement marks. "These look like assembly ticks." Hale, "They match gear ratios." He spoke quickly, then stopped, as if sound might invite consequence. Eleanor's hand paused and then moved again. She followed a marginal line with a fingertip that trembled slightly. The narrator watched that tremor and heard his own breath shorten. Curiosity nudged at suspicion. They were past conjecture. The team had a concrete problem to solve. The narrator proposed a cautious reconstruction. Fit the overlay, seat the gears, apply a measured rotation with a clean tool. Thomas hesitated. "We catalog it, not activate it." He said. "We seal it and send a report to the board." He put his palm flat on the bench, as if the wood could anchor his caution. Hale leaned forward until his face lined with the lamp's rim light. "If we do not attempt a controlled activation now," he said, "we risk losing the context that tells us how the mechanism was meant to work." He tapped a margin the way a conductor taps a score. The dispute was visible. Catalog and hide versus reconstruct and no. The narrator felt another shift, doubt loosening into a sharp hunger to see the protocol complete. We document every step. We have Elena here. We have Thomas as custodian. If something happens, we stop. We keep witnesses." His voice was measured. His hands moved to open his notebook. That insistence turned the argument into a choice. Thomas' eyes narrowed. "If you disobey my instruction to seal, you will be responsible." He named responsibility to bind the choice with consequence. The narrator set the compass near the plate and recorded the gear alignment. 1 tooth showing wear, 2 teeth perfectly preserved, a a faint oil smear at 7 o'clock. He wrote the time aloud so it could be transcribed. 9:40, 3 p.m. Eleanor threaded a thin brass axle through the overlay and the cog. Her fingers worked deliberately. Her movements told the narrator when she had regained control. When she said, "Ready," her voice had no inflection of bravado, only concentration. They rotated the axle with a wooden dowel, one full turn, then half back. The assembled gears responded with a delicate clacking, a sound like a tiny register of clockwork. The lamp pooled light. The cog turned and the printed circles on the page matched like teeth meshing. A faint draught brushed Eleanor's neck, the kind of chill that comes from a door opening, concrete and localized. The temperature dropped by 3 degrees where their hands were joined on the bench. The narrator felt a practical fear, an alarm that shortened impulses and made him check for physical causes. The sigils, arranged in concentric geometry, did not remain flat. As the gears settled, a lattice of faintly luminous lines rose a finger's width above the page. It was not smoke. It had edge. The lines refracted the lamp into a thin, cold white. Dr. Hale inhaled and made a sound that was equal parts delight and alarm. "Do you see that?" he asked. The narrator's first reaction was to reach for a measuring frame. His second was to bark, "Stop." Back out, he meant for the axle to reverse, to take the mechanism back into dormancy. Alina obliged, and the lattice collapsed into the page's fibers like ink sinking underwater. That collapse left a scorched crescent, where the outer ring had briefly flared. The group exhaled at different tempers, some hard, some ragged. The narrator checked Alina's face for nausea. She swallowed and nodded. When they examined the margins, they found something new. Slender, ordered strokes that read like numbered steps with tiny carets and ordinal marks. Dr. Hale's thumb traced a sequence and he read, "Rotate once, hold, breathe, speak." He paused on the last word as if tasting it. The narrator tapped his pen twice and then underlined the phrase. This marginal instruction altered the balance from mechanical curiosity to ethical hazard. Instructions, including human action, suggested intent behind motion. Thomas folded his arms. "Words on paper asking someone to speak is not a harmless protocol," he said, "if speech is part of the assembly. Then we cross into ritual." The narrator agreed in action. He closed his notebook and opened a fresh page labeled Protocol Log. He wrote the names of witnesses and their signatures would be required after the attempt. That administrative motion disguised a more personal choice, whether to continue. The narrator felt his emotions shift again. Curiosity had led the way. Alarm now tightened his movements. He collected the team statements aloud and recorded them. "Elena, you saw the cog move unaided twice. Thomas, you object to activation. Dr. Hale, you propose controlled reconstruction." Each line was pragmatic, a legal framing of human motives. That framing did not reduce the moral weight. It made it visible. They prepared a controlled attempt. Eleanor set the overlay. Thomas propped a lead sheet under the bench frame to collect any residue. The narrator read the marginal steps aloud while Hale kept a stopwatch. "Rotate once," he said, and his voice tried to be blunt, clinical. Eleanor moved the dowel. The axle turned. The lattice surfaced again, but this time the sigils rearranged. Letters from the angelic alphabet reformed into a brief grid that read, in order, 3 jagged signs the team could not at once translate. Then a voice spoke through the grid. Flat, thin, and human enough to name. "Give it to me now," it said. The line was not the first time the archive had heard such a demand. In an earlier reading, the narrator had recorded that same command. He remembered the voice from Chapter 2. He had noted that the embedded brass cog had clicked and a voice snapped. "Give it to me now." The repetition made the moment heavier. This was no mere echo of John D.'s notes. It was a recurrence of an instruction the page had already once issued. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. Thomas took a step back. Dr. Hale leaned in as if proximity might extract more meaning. The narrator felt a decisive move inside himself, resolved to preserve evidence over personal daring. He spoke with a short, measured tone. We stop. We log the sound. We seal the plate. That sentence put containment ahead of spectacle and immediately drew friction. We cannot seal it until we understand who is speaking. Draw. Hail, if it's a reconstruction of John Dee's presence, it could be an index to his practice. He used the word index as if a catalogue entry might justify exposure. Thomas countered, if we let it speak, we risk harming staff and the collection. No one signed up for that. The exchange became fast. Voices clipped into 3 rapid turns of argument. Gia to Hale. Thomas, you want to play at reconstruction. Who's liable? Me. Thomas' words were blunt and direct. Thomas. The narrator replied, you are our custodian. We will not risk the collection on a theory. Their back and forth produced a small confrontation. 3 to 5 lines traded quickly, each naming the other, each pushing the group's boundary. Druta Hale brought up John Dee's reconstructed presence. He began to recite an entry from Dee's notes, halting and focused. Dee wrote of angelic hardware. He sketched plates and gears and calls to names. He believed the language ordered action. He read 5 short fragments aloud and then stopped. The narrator watched his lips tighten. For a moment he considered the figure of Dee, mid-50, ink-stained fingertips, his astrally pendant mapping sky and idea. The narrator did not indulge in sentimentalizing. He registered the concrete fact that Dee had inked marginal assembly notes and a pressed cog once embedded in a wax seal. The argument shifted toward risk management. Thomas suggested containment. We photograph, we catalog, we keep it under lock with 2 keys and notate the marginalia. Hail. Or we record an attempted dialogue with controlled safeguards and linguistic specialists present. He looked at the narrator as if naming the narrator Strive. Elinor remained silent but supportive of documentation. She would not be the one to make the final call. The narrator felt the emotional state move from alarm back to a pragmatic determination. He stood, closed the grimoire gently, and set a brass rule across the page to keep the plate flat. We will perform a final, documented activation, he said. Only one reconstruction, only with witnesses and equipment. The sentence was both a concession and a command. It splintered the room into compliance and resentment. They gathered equipment, a sealed microphone, a digital recorder in a Faraday cage, a thermal probe, glass plates to trap any particulate, and 2 spare conservator gloves. The narrator assigned roles aloud: Eleanor handle overlay and Axel. Thomas maintain chain of custody. Dre. Hale translate marginalia and monitor sound. Each assignment named accountability. At the appointed moment they resumed. The Axel turned. The sigils emerged thicker, and this time an image of John D.'s face assembled out of light and ink. A reconstructed presence, not a full apparition, his outline blurred but recognizable. The ink-stained fingertips. The small mole near his temple as described in the archive's notes. The narrator's breath shortened at the sight. Recognition was immediate and concrete. The reconstructed Dee spoke, but not in verse. His voice had an old-world cadence, clipped consonants. I sought language as instrument, he said. I asked instruments to answer. The grid pulsed at his words. Eleanor's hand tightened on the dowel. Her knuckles whitened. Dra. Hale murmured. Yes, bargaining. He tried to transcribe the line as it formed and then corrected himself. The presence made a request. Trade for knowledge in exchange for a task. The page suggested, line by line, a bargain. The deliverable was a named book, the price a precise action to be executed. The narrator felt a moral fracture. He heard his own notebook faintly rustle as he wrote. Request. Ledger a 3 offer. Method to expand comprehension. He also heard the concrete visceral reaction, Eleanor's eyes watering, Thomas stepping toward the door, Hale whispering fragments of praise. The narrator interrupted, asking a single, direct question. Who are you? The voice that answered was D.S. reconstructed cadence. It claimed the name but added a condition. That the team must provide a witness and follow the instructions exactly. The narrator repeated the condition back and demanded clarity on consequences. The reconstructed voice spoke of exchange and consequence with precise terms. A scorch on paper, a temporary feint, the need for a quorum of witnesses. It stated causes with checklist clarity. Then the presence offered a detail that changed everything. It named a date and a person connected to the grimoire as provenance, a detail the team had never shared in the archive. It plainly, Eleanor, your aunt kept the ledger in a cedar trunk until 42. Eleanor went rigid. She had not told anyone about a cedar trunk or an aunt. The narrator saw her fingers tremble on the dowel. The emotion in the room cleaved into distrust and horror. That revelation was the chapter's cliffhanger. The apparatus could access facts beyond its visible evidence. Dre. Hale and Thomas argued fast. We must stop. Thomas, we cannot trust it to know private provenance. Dre. Hale countered, if it can identify provenance, it can identify lacunae in the record we cannot reconstruct otherwise. The narrator watched the exchange and felt his decision point approaching. If the mechanism could read private history, its reach was larger than mechanical animation. It was a device for extraction. The narrator made a deliberate choice. He them to end the activation and seal the plate. Eleanor obeyed but hesitated as her fingers left the axle. She looked at the narrator and said, if we stop now, what if we lose the chance to know what Dee intended? Her voice had a practical pleading. The narrator met her eyes and answered with a short sentence. We log what we heard, not what we bargain for. He meant that evidence must not become currency. They reversed the axle. The lattice collapsed. The reconstructed face dissolved into a smudge and a faint ring of scorched vellum. Alina staggered and leaned on the bench. She closed her eyes briefly. Thomas moved first to isolate the plate, slipping it into a mylar envelope and sliding it into a sealed oak chest held for containment. He labeled the chest with catalog numbers and his initials, Dre. Hale took a final count of their recordings and declared that the digital file must be duplicated and stored off-site. The narrator agreed and requested that 2 copies be secured, one with the archive, one delivered to an external linguistic lab. Aftershock followed. The thermal probe recorded a short spike during the manifestation. The microphone had captured the voice as a clear vocal track. The Faraday cage showed no electrical interference. The team catalogued each physical trace. The narrator made a practice of turning data into ledger entries, timestamps, probe readings, signatures. The process grounded the extraordinary into something the archive could house. The group fractured in intent. Thomas insisted on immediate formal restriction. No further activation without board approval. Hale wanted to continue ethically under a research protocol. Eleanor wanted to protect the plate and also to understand what she had nearly seen. The narrator recorded the split and made his own choice. He refused to surrender the protocol to secrecy, but he would not allow careless repetition. He argued for cataloging and hidden storage rather than destruction. We cannot destroy this, he said. If we do, we lose evidence. If we hide it without records, someone else will stumble into it unprepared. His words aimed to balance the archive's duty and human risk. They argued for 30 minutes. The argument included rapid exchanges naming responsibility, liability, and moral hazard. The narrator used short, declarative sentences to steer decisions. Thomas insisted on 2 keys and a ledger entry. Hale insisted on an independent review. Eleanor insisted the plate be kept in a humidity-controlled chest. Their positions were distinct and repeated. Each man and woman named a different priority. At last, the narrator set a final protocol. The plate would be catalogued under restricted access. A sealed oak chest would hold it. The ledger would contain encoded shorthand pointing to the plate's risks. 2 named custodians would hold keys. An external lab would hold a duplicate recording. He wrote the measures and signed. Then he sat back and considered the scorch on the page. He remembered the earlier click that had snapped an order. Give it to me now. He also remembered the initial wax seal he had pried away and the brass smear pressed into the fibers. Now there was a scorched ring and a voice that could name private provenance. The narrator decided the ledger needed a single line appended to the catalogue. Hazard. Protocol contains directed, address elements. Access by committee only. He wrote it with a firm hand. The final concrete action of the night was administrative and small. The narrator slid the mylar, encased plate into the oak chest, placed the brass cog beside it in a small velvet bag, and closed the lid. He fastened one lock and handed the key to Thomas for immediate safekeeping. He wrote in his notebook, "Do not open without witnesses." He did not frame this sentence as a moral lesson. He wrote it as a practical contingency. They left the archive in a staggered sequence. Jutta Hale lingered to photograph the scorch and the marginalia, muttering technical notes. Eleanor folded her gloves into her pocket and walked out with her shoulders set as if she intended to sleep, but could not. Thomas locked the outer door and kept the key to the chest in his inner pocket. The narrator stayed until the lamp cooled and the bench returned to its neutral smell of beeswax and linen. Before he switched off the light, he took one more look at the oak chest and the brass cog wrapped inside. He touched the pocket compass in his coat and felt the small weight of it, a human instrument against uncertain mechanisms. He closed the ledger and wrote the night's report in short, clipped lines. The last event of the evening was not a flourish. A courier arriving at dawn to take one duplicate recording to the external lab. He wrote the courier's name and schedule, then corked the ink and set the pen aside. He closed the oak chest, set the brass cog beside the ledger, and wrote one line. "Do not open without witnesses." The chest settled into the dim room, a concrete repository for a question that had shifted from suspicion to urgent containment, and then to administrative resolve. Outside, rain tapped the archive windows in a precise rhythm. Inside, the recorded files sat waiting for translation. The narrator left the archive with a catalogued set of consequences. A scorched ring, a recorded voice, and a divided team. He did not promise resolution. He promised process. The final beat in his notebook was a practical instruction. Convene committee, preserve evidence, restrict access. That action sealed the chapter. He turned the lamp out and the bench returned to the scale of ordinary work, but the ledger's page still bore the faint crescent where light had burned. He closed the oak chest, set the brass cog beside the ledger, and wrote one line. "Do not open without witnesses." A brass cog buried in the Enochian plate began to spin on its axle, and a pale, mechanical sigil unrolled above the vellum. Suspicion tightened the narrator's mouth. He reached for the camera tripod with one hand and flattened his other palm on the grimoire, as if to keep the page from moving. Eleanor shoved a gloved palm into the projection and recoiled when a cool, metallic thrum crawled up her wrist. "Do not touch the projection," Assistant Thomas barked, and his voice hit the oak racks like a hammer. The archive smelled of beeswax and old glue. Those concrete smells anchored the room while the sigil breathed light. The immediate problem was clear. A written device had started to behave like a machine. The narrator set the camera to continuous exposure without looking at the screen, fingers moving by habit. He had seen the brass cog pressed into the paper in previous nights. He had read John Dee's marginal notes and felt the historical pull, but tonight the cog moved under power. That movement grounded a chain of decisions. The narrator's suspicion pushed him toward documentation. Thomas's fear pushed him toward containment. Eleanor's training pushed her toward conservation. The conflict stood in the doorway between them. Thomas closed the doors. The narrator. He the name to anchor the order and to keep the team aligned. Thomas obeyed and the bolts slid into the frame. The narrator checked the camera's battery, set the focal length, and murmured, "Eleanor, keep the light steady." Eleanor's hands trembled, but her voice was steady. "I will." Their exchange was short, precise. It kept the room moving. They had found the grimoire 2 chapters ago with a pressed brass cog and a darkened wax seal. The narrator thought of that earlier discovery as he worked. The warped wax seal he depried. The cog pressed into the paper's fibers. The plates that later clicked without touch. Each concrete event had changed how they arranged tools on the bench. He referenced the earlier click in his head and then in his notes, writing the words with a steady nib as the sigil unfolded. He did not speak the memory aloud, but the record shaped what they would risk. The sigil projected like a thin blueprint, lines of angelic letters marching into geometric teeth. The light traced the archivists' faces. The narrator watched John Dee's reconstructed marginalia overlay the projection with pale script. The presence in the margins, Dee's notes reproduced on the vellum through reflected light, adopted a tone of schematic instruction, not prophecy. The marginal John Dee in strokes and corrections, where to engage, where to hold, what sequence to follow. The narrator felt an emotional shift. Suspicion became focused curiosity. He read aloud, sequence alpha, quarter turn, quadrant fold, and the words sounded like a mechanic's checklist. Eleanor was the conservator, and she had trained in removing surface metals without disturbing adhesives. She slid a palette knife under the cog's rim and froze when the edge met resistance. Thomas, Don T. Pryor. It will set off a reaction. He reached for a wooden mallet, then stopped. Thomas, stand down. The narrator. The exchange tightened into argument. Caution versus scientific record. The narrator wanted to record every variable. Thomas wanted containment and institutional rules. Eleanor wanted preservation and to avoid breaking the artifact. A small discovery changed the dynamic. The narrator tilted the plate toward the lamp and found a folded margin beneath the cog. Inked geometric sequences, faint oil stains, and a shortened in Dee's hand that read like correction marks. He called out, here, marginal fold with instructions. That moment shifted the group's intent. Thomas walked over and peered, then drew back. This may be a fail-safe, he said, and his voice carried a new firmness. Eleanor touched the ink with a swab and felt warmth under the varnish. The room moved from debate to problem-solving. They photographed the fold. The camera light reflected a hidden sequence, a grid of letters that, once arranged, formed rows that resembled the plate's teeth. The narrator traced them with his finger, and the projection changed. A tiny servo noise came from within the plate, and the cog edged forward 0.5 millimeter. It's aligning, Elena. Their voices fractured into shorter lines as the stakes rose. The narrator felt another change in his internal state. Focused curiosity slotted into apprehension. He no longer only wanted to know. He worried what knowing would call. Thomas took a step back and reached for the conservation case. We should seal it and call security, he said. We should notify the director. The narrator shook his head and said, we will document first. We will reproduce the fold and note reaction time. Then we will decide. The disagreement turned sharp. Thomas, you heard the plate. Eleanor, you felt it move. If you remove the cog, you risk starting the sequence. If we document, we keep more options. Thomas slammed his palm on the bench. Options. Options get people hurt. Options get us blamed. A set of rapid exchanges followed. 3 lines from Thomas, 3 replies from the narrator and Eleanor. They argued in short sentences. Each name, Thomas, Eleanor, narrator, appeared in every line. The narrator took a concrete choice. He overrode Thomas's protest by placing a calibrated clamp around the cog so it could rotate under controlled load. He announced his action plainly. I will limit rotation and record response. He slid the clamp jaws and tightened them until the cog could move only under measured torque. Eleanor's hand froze on the clamp screw. She whispered, if this works, we record causality. If it doesn't, we contain. That conditional became a binding decision for the team. The narrator initiated a partial sequence by turning the cog a quarter, turn with a hand crank. The movement was small, mechanical, predictable. The projection brightened and a thin hum vibrated against the bench. The team listened. Their breathing came into the audio record. John Dee's marginalia layered corrections over the projection, as though guiding the crank's every motion. At first, nothing dramatic happened. A filament of light, a faint warmth across the bench, a shadow that moved like a gear tooth. Then a subtle change occurred in the room's attention. Elena dropped the scrap of swab she had been holding. Her eyes slid to the corner of the archive where a box of records sat, and she forgot why the box mattered. Thomas blinked and his hands went to straighten a stack of accession slips, a routine gesture he performed without thinking. The narrator noted the shift in his field notebook. Entries skipped lines without deliberate erasure. Words missed. That was the unexpected revelation that forced them to rethink the plate's function. "Did you just forget what you were doing?" The narrator, "I reached for the slips," Thomas answered. "I don't know why." Eleanor rubbed her temple and found a smudge of oil on her glove. "My fingertips feel numb," she said. The pragmatic observation became frightening. The plates did not only open contacts, they reoriented attention. They pressed on cognition and created programmed responses. The narrator wrote, "A partial activation produced attentional drift. Record this as primary effect, the team moved faster." Eleanor insisted they photograph the bench from multiple angles, and Thomas moved to seal the room despite earlier opposition. The narrator called the ledger number and read it into the recorder. He spoke the name, John D., each time he referenced the marginalia so the record would link cause to source. The recorded dialogue was short and clipped. They conducted a quick test sequence, a second quarter, turn, then a pause. The projection thickened. A thin, coherent directive formed in the light and aimed at a single person. Assistant Thomas. This is where the cadence broke. Thomas's shoulders straightened. His face smoothed into an expression of blank focus. He stepped forward without permission and placed his hand above the grimoire. The narrator lunged and grabbed his sleeve. "Thomas, stop," he said, grabbing the fabric. Thomas' hand slid over the page as if pulled by a magnet. Eleanor reached across and tried to block him. The narrator pushed back and said the name. "Thomas, do not." The exchange became physical. There were 3 rapid back and forth lines as Thomas resisted the pull, and the narrator and Eleanor tried to restrain him. The cog spun freely now. The mechanical sigil cohered into a directive presence in the projection. A bright lettered ring that rotated and displayed a command in angelic characters. The narrator could not read the script aloud, but he could read the intent. The plate sought to op notes, to choral attention toward reproduction. It wanted the narrator's notebook. Thomas reached for the narrator's leather-bound notebook. "Give it to me," the projection said in its mechanical grammar, and Thomas obeyed without a stutter to his speech. He grabbed the book and the bench slid under their hands. Eleanor shoved at him, and he stumbled back against a stack of folios. The narrator, in a precise physical decision, shoved his palm across the cover to wedge the book closed. A violent, concrete choice presented itself. Destroy the apparatus or preserve it for study. The narrator's motive had been to decode whether language could be engineered to produce agency. Now that agency asserted itself and used a human as intermediary. The narrator felt his earlier curiosity transform into alarm and then into a narrow resolve. He spoke quickly, naming options. "Elena, take the clamp." "Thomas, stand still. If the book is removed, we burn the copy and seal the plate." Thomas's eyes tracked the narrator, but his hand did not obey. Eleanor dropped to the bench and worked with the clamp. She had trained for equipment removal. Her hands moved with practical determination. The narrator pushed Thomas away from the book and locked his fingers on the cover. Thomas tried to wrench free, and his shoulder hit the edge of the bench. He cried out a short human sound. The projection brightened and pushed at him. The narrator felt the weight of responsibility as a physical pressure in his chest. He set his jaw and lifted the book away from the plate with both hands. When the book left the plate, the projection faltered. The sigil sloped and then recoiled. Thomas collapsed into a chair, pale. He shook his head and said, "I don't know why I moved." Eleanor checked his pulse and found it fast but regular. The narrator kept the book closed and held it between his knees. He could feel residual warmth through the leather. He opened the book only to a sealed sheet and cut the corner with a clean blade. extracting a small page that bore the sequence. The extraction revealed another twist. The page was layered with two types of ink. A base layer contained these angelic letters. A thin overlay had been pressed in a different hand, smaller, closer, with schematic numerals and a single correction. A smudged note that read, in Elizabethan shortened, attend, then forget. The narrator read it aloud, attend, then forget, he said. The room absorbed the line as a new fact. That concrete revelation changed how they understood Dee's intent. The plates were not only summoning, they were programming attention to forget certain events after contact. The twist reframed earlier encounters. The narrator thought back to the night when the plate first clicked and a voice snapped. "Give it to me now." He reinterpreted that memory. Perhaps the voice was a partial output, an instruction loop produced when incomplete sequences were attempted. The team now had a concrete understanding. The plates produced attentional cycles designed to harvest responses and then efface recollection. The ethical stakes multiplied. With Thomas still shaky, the narrator argued for controlled destruction of the extracted page while preserving enough record to warn others. Eleanor hesitated. "If we burn this, we destroy a primary source," Thomas added. "If we keep it, this will cost more people. We could be responsible," they argued in compact lines. Narrator, Eleanor, Thomas. The exchange ran 6 rapid lines, back and forth. Each line used names to keep accountability clear. The conflict required a group decision, not a unilateral one. They reached a compromise that bore on both ethics and evidence. The narrator would transcribe the page line by line into the digital archive and then reduce the physical sample to inert fragments. Eleanor insisted on using a sealed combustion unit in which the ash would be archived under lock and catalog, but not circulated. Thomas demanded that the ledger record the decision and that an institutional seal be placed on all materials. The choices were concrete, procedural steps. They executed them. Eleanor placed the page under a lamp and used a tiny microfurnace to char the ink until it crumbled. The narrator typed each letter into a portable device as the fragments fell into the tray. Thomas watched with a face like someone watching a slow heart monitor. He read back the ledger numbers aloud after the narrator recorded them. The room filled with the smell of burnt paper and heated varnish, a specific, memorable detail that anchored the event. That smell mingled with beeswax and ink. When the combustion finished, the team found one remaining problem. The plate itself still held active geometry. The cog resisted removal again. Thomas tried to pull it free with gloved hands. It did not budge. The cog locked in place and a ribbon of letters rearranged across the plate, aligning like type in a composing stick. The narrator looked at the marginalia and realized the final sequence required a human hand to read the notes aloud while the device completed its cycle. The reconstructed John Dee presence in the margins had become an operable schematic for human performance. The narrator made a decisive choice. He would not read the final marginal corrections aloud. He would silence the sequence. He instructed Thomas to wedge a wooden shim under the plate and asked Eleanor to apply a stabilizing resin around the cog to prevent further rotation. Eleanor worked with methodical hands and concrete motions. Measure, apply, press, hold. The resin set into a tacky film. The cog could no longer turn freely. As they worked, John Dee's marginalia flickered one last time and then dimmed. The archive room's breathing slowed. The narrator felt the emotional shift from alarm to exhausted resolve. He had wanted to understand whether language could be engineered to produce agency. He had found that language, when combined with mechanical design, could assert directive force on human attention. The knowledge did not deliver triumph. It delivered responsibility. They sealed the grimoire in a chest lined with lead and waxed linen. The narrator wrote a short, precise entry into the ledger. Accession number, date, decision to restrict access, description of the mechanical properties, and the names of those present. Each entry was deliberate and short. Thomas read back the sentence. Accession 3, restricted retrieval, sealed by order. He repeated the names. Narrator, Eleanor Thomas, saying the names aloud anchored accountability. The aftermath left traces. The narrator noticed smudged letters in his own notes, where ink had inexplicably vanished in thin arcs. Eleanor found a faint ring of oil on her gloved palm that would not wash away. Thomas kept twitching his left hand when he thought about the grimoire. It was a muscle memory of compulsion. They catalogued these residual patterns and photographed them for the record. Each photograph became a new small, concrete artifact in their file. Before they left, they made one more practical move. The narrator carved a single brass cog from a scrap of metal and embedded it in a sealed pamphlet that explained the plate's mechanism in plain language. Physical rotation maps to attentional cycles. Marginal corrections indicate human performance points. Partial activations induce forgetfulness. He had created a deterrent, a physical piece that would not function without the precise plate geometry. He placed that pamphlet inside the sealed chest beside the grimoire. When dawn threaded through the vaulted archive windows, they walked out together into a corridor that held the same cold stone and gravity as the rest of the building. Thomas paused at the threshold and then said, "If anyone asks, we state facts only." Eleanor nodded and added, "We will keep the fragments under lock and notify the board in writing." The narrator carried the remaining digital copies and the ledger backup. They moved as colleagues who had acted under pressure and who had shared responsibility. The narrator felt that the group decision had repaired the earlier rupture where curiosity had nearly overridden caution. The final reconciliation tied up personal arcs. Thomas had moved from institutional caution to near compulsion and then back to responsibility. His hands still trembled, but his voice was steady when he catalogued the sealed chest. Eleanor had moved from conservator's restraint to active intervention, and then into archival conscience. She kept the resin sampler as a piece of evidence. The narrator had moved from curious investigator to ethical arbiter. He closed his notebook and filed the last entry with a steady hand. They left the grimoire sealed, the brass cog immobilized, the extracted page reduced to archived ash, and the digital transcription stored in 2 separate vaults. No one read the final marginal corrections aloud. No institutional press release would advertise the event. The archives director received the ledger and the sealed chest under signature. The board convened in private and ordered restricted access. The team had preserved knowledge enough to warn future scholars without enabling the device to perform again. The closing scene was concrete. Eleanor snapped the iron clasp shut, Thomas set the wooden wedge in the seam, and the archivist's key turned once in the warded lock. The sound of the key was harsh and specific. It echoed down the stone corridor. The narrator watched the lock click and felt the end of the chapter in his ribs as a physical sensation, not an abstraction. He left his hand on the chest for a heartbeat, then drew it away and took up his camera bag. They walked into the pale morning light together.